Hey everyone, welcome to my introductory TypeScript tutorial. In this video, I'm going to be talking a lot about the benefits of using TypeScript, and we're going to go over how TypeScript works by building a small application using TypeScript. Now, TypeScript is one of those tools where it's kind of hard to rationalize the benefits of using it until you've experienced the benefits on your own, which is why I think building a small application is probably the best way to learn it. So we'll go through, we'll figure out how to set up TypeScript, we'll build a small application using it, and I'll explain everything along the way. Now, if you're excited about learning TypeScript, please smash that like button for me, subscribe if you haven't already, and let's go ahead and dig in. So I definitely need to take a moment and just talk about what TypeScript is, why I personally love it, and why I think it's gaining popularity. So TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. It is a programming language that is basically JavaScript, but with a couple of extra features. And these extra features give JavaScript some substantial benefits. Now, you got to understand that TypeScript is not supported by web browsers. So in order to use TypeScript, you have to use a TypeScript compiler in order to compile TypeScript down into JavaScript. So in essence, what you're doing is you're writing code in TypeScript that eventually becomes JavaScript, and TypeScript is very similar to JavaScript. In fact, you can pretty much write plain JavaScript in your TypeScript files and it would work perfectly fine. But then there would be no benefit of using the features of TypeScript, obviously. So what are the benefits of using TypeScript? Well, first and foremost, TypeScript is a typed language, so basically it gives JavaScript the ability to have types. So what are types? Well, you know in JavaScript you already have kind of data types, right? So you have numbers, you have strings, you have booleans, you have arrays of booleans, you have arrays of strings, etc. And in JavaScript, you can assign values of types to variables without declaring the type. So in other words, you can say const thing equals some value. And it doesn't matter if it's a number, it doesn't matter if it's a string. You don't have to say that. It's just going to assign that value to that variable. Well, in TypeScript, you have the ability to use types. And so therefore you can say that this variable or this value is of this type. But what kind of benefit does that really give us? That has actually led to a lot of debates in the developer community in the past. You see, it used to be rather kind of a pain to get TypeScript up and running in your projects. And the question was, are these benefits worth the trouble of setting this up? And as time goes on, you can see that it's becoming more and more popular, and it's also becoming easier and easier to integrate into your projects thanks to a lot of tools that are coming out. So clearly the value exists, but I must say that it is kind of difficult to simply explain the value that it provides in just a sentence or two. You kind of have to experience it, because here's the thing. TypeScript is going to, in the end, save you an enormous amount of time. It's going to make code a lot easier to read. It's going to make your code editing experience, if you have the right type of code editor, a lot better, and I mean a lot better. It is going to allow you to find bugs before you even run the code. It's going to allow you to rationalize your code easier. It provides a ton of value. But again, this is stuff you have to kind of experience. It's not exactly easy to grasp the benefit of something like this unless you've experienced it. So what I want to do in this video is actually build a very small application using TypeScript. It's going to be a quiz app, so it's just going to basically ask you a couple of questions. You're going to answer them. You're going to have like multiple choice, and then at the end it shows you your score. So a very simple app, but through the practice of actually building a small application using TypeScript, you'll start to see the benefits. Now, you won't see the true benefits until you build a larger application with a team. Then you'll see the real true value that TypeScript provides, but you'll still start to at least dip your finger into the potential of what TypeScript can offer you. And I also want to say that this video will very likely end up serving as a prerequisite to future videos as well, because I'm probably going to end up putting out a more in-depth TypeScript tutorial in the future, and also probably some projects using TypeScript as well. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start this thing off by creating an empty directory for me to put my project inside of. So I have my code editor open here. I have my tutorials folder open. I'm going to cd into TypeScript basics. So TypeScript basics, if I ls, you can see it's an empty directory. There's nothing in here whatsoever. I want to initialize an npm project. So I'm just going to say npm init. Package name is fine. That's fine. Description, I'm going to leave empty. Entry point, that's fine. Test command, all this is fine. And that looks good. So I'm going to clear that out, ls, and now I have a package JSON file. Okay. Okay, so empty npm project. I need to go ahead and get TypeScript installed. So I'm going to npm install -- save dev TypeScript. Now, note that I'm using save dev. TypeScript is only a developer tool. Again, no browsers are going to be able to read TypeScript. So we're going to end up compiling our TypeScript into regular JavaScript. So we only need to include this in the code locally on our machine. Once this thing gets deployed to a production server or anything like that, if you're using TypeScript in your projects, you don't need to have that as an actual dependency. It only serves as a dev dependency. So save, go ahead and let that install. Good to go. Okay, so what we need to do now, because we have this very basic npm project setup, is we have to set up a little bit of the file structure that makes sense for a TypeScript project. Now, this is just going to be vanilla TypeScript. In other words, I'm not going to be using React. I'm not going to be using any type of framework. I'm just going to be using basically vanilla JavaScript, except I'm using TypeScript. So in order to set that up, I just want to make sure that I have an index.html file that holds my HTML. I want to have a dist folder where my compiled JavaScript is going to live. And then I want to have a source folder where the TypeScript that I'm going to write is going to live, so that we can compile all of the code from the source folder into the dist folder. And then inside of my HTML file, I'm going to reference the code inside of the dist folder. So to do that, I'm simply going to open up this directory with my code editor, and I'm going to start by creating a dist folder, a source folder, and I'm going to create a public folder. And the public folder is where my index.html file is going to live, along with my styles. And now we have the public folder ready to go. I can go ahead and set up the skeleton for my HTML. And inside of here, it's going to be pretty simple. I'm going to change the title to be TypeScript Basics. I'll go ahead and link my CSS file. And then I want to link some JavaScript. Now, I don't have any TypeScript or JavaScript yet, but I will soon. So I just want to go ahead and get that taken care of now. So I'm going to create a script tag and set the source equal to. I need to leave this public directory and go into my dist directory, and I will actually reference a file called script.js. Now again, I'm going to be writing TypeScript, and TypeScript uses the .ts extension, and I'm going to be writing that in the source folder. But what's going to happen is that script.ts file is going to end up getting compiled into the dist folder as a script.js file. So I want to reference the JS file and not the TS file, because again, you can't read TypeScript in the web browser. So go ahead and save this, and I'll come back to this when I want to start writing up my HTML, but I want to continue setting up my TypeScript project for now. So the next step is actually going to be to initialize the TypeScript project itself, and it's going to end up creating a configuration file called a tsconfig. So in order to easily do that, I'm just going to open up the terminal that I had here, and then I'm going to run npx tsc -- init, and that's hyphen init, not -- my apologies. So we're going to run npx tsc hyphen init. Okay, so once that finishes, it's going to say successfully created a tsconfig.json file. Now I can see a tsconfig file inside of my project directory, and it created a massive JSON object with a bunch of options that have been commented out, and then documentation about what this option does. And some of these are uncommented as defaults. Now for target, I do not want to compile my TypeScript to ES5. This is 2021. I think it's pretty safe nowadays to use ES6. So if you're trying to support old browsers, leave it at ES5, but I think it's okay for this tutorial at the very least to use ES6. So I'm going to compile to ES6. CommonJS is fine. Now, the only other options I want to change are the out directory and the root directory. So I'm going to uncomment these, and we already know what the root directory is. It's that source folder that I already created. So I've created the root directory, that's the source folder, and the out directory I've created as well, which is the dist folder. So I just need to specify those here. The out directory is /dist, and the root directory is /source. So now TypeScript, the TypeScript compiler, will read this tsconfig file and determine that the root directory where my TypeScript is going to be the source folder. And once it compiles all of that, the out directory is the dist folder, which is where it's going to then put the compiled JavaScript. So I'm done with this tsconfig file. I'll go ahead and save it. And let me go ahead and start this whole thing off by creating a script.ts file inside of my source folder. And I'm just going to console.log something. Let's just say hello world. Now I'm going to save this. And obviously, if I were to just simply run this right now, if I run this with my server and go inside of here, obviously we're not going to see the console.log. And also we're going to get an error because the script file does not exist, because we actually have to run the compilation process to get that TypeScript file into our source folder as a JavaScript file. So it doesn't just happen automatically. I need to actually run the compilation process. So in order to do that, I'm going to use my terminal here and say npx tsc, and I'm just going to press enter. Now let's go to the project and see what's inside of our dist folder. In fact, I see a script.js file now. It looks like it's compiled correctly. And And now when I go over here, it automatically updated because I'm using live server. If you're not, if you're just opening the HTML file in your browser, you can click refresh. But here we see hello world. So we know that the JavaScript is working as expected. So basically we've written this script.ts file here, which is just plain JavaScript. And again, it's TypeScript and JavaScript are basically the same, but with just a few extra features. So you can write plain JavaScript in your TypeScript, but it compiled it down to a JavaScript file as expected. And the HTML file is reading that JavaScript file. We officially have TypeScript set up for our project. However, one thing that I don't like is that if I go into the script.ts file, our TypeScript file, and I change this to hello internet and I click save, if I go back to the browser, it's still going to say hello world because I still have to go back into my terminal and then run npx tsc again. What would be nice is if every single time I saved the file, it would run the compilation process. That way I didn't have to run npx tsc manually every single time. And luckily that command exists right out of the box. So npx tsc dash or hyphen w, and that's going to watch. So you can see here that it says starting application, starting compilation in watch mode. Cool. So if I go to the browser, it currently says hello internet. Now if I change it to say world again, save it and go back to the browser, it says world now. So now I don't have to manually run npx tsc. So this is a TypeScript tutorial, so I'm not going to bore you with writing a bunch of HTML. So I'm just going to paste this in here, and don't worry, the source code is in the description, so you can easily just go to there, go to the GitHub, copy this HTML in, and I'll quickly explain it. We have a empty div for the question text, a select box that we're going to populate using the TypeScript, a couple of buttons, one for submitting and one for beginning the trivia, and then we have a score header, all of which are pretty much empty. We're going to just basically populate that with TypeScript. That's it for the HTML. I can just get rid of this tab now and focus solely on our TypeScript. So how do we want this trivia to start off? Well, I'm just going to start by hard coding some questions, and I've already got these. So the questions that I've got are from funtrivia.com. If you want to get more, you can go there, or you can just copy the ones from the source code. Questions is just an array of question objects. Each question has an ID, the actual question text, the correct answer, and then 3 incorrect answers as an array of strings. So I've got 3 total, just 3 questions, very simple app. And then after these questions, I just want to reference some of the elements inside of my document. So I'm pasting in here. We have the score element, the answers select element, the question text element, submit button element, and the start button element, which are all possibly null because there's no guarantee that these exist in the DOM to this TypeScript file. So keep that in mind. You in your head may know, hey, I know that I've written the HTML to include a div with a ID of score element. So therefore in my head, I know that it exists, but this file doesn't know that. To this file, it knows that it's either going to be an HTML element or it's going to be null because maybe there's not an ID of score in the document. If you're using VS Code, if you're using a modern editor, you can actually hover over this and it will show you the type here. It'll say it's either HTML element or null. So now I know that this score element is either an HTML element or it's null. Now, before I forget, go ahead and run to the GitHub page where the code is and paste in the CSS into your project. That way, initially the score and the question text and some of the other things will not be visible to start because when we first load the page, we only want to see begin quiz button. Then when you click the begin quiz button, we want to start showing some other stuff, but we want to make sure that the display is none for the other stuff. So go ahead and just run to the GitHub, copy the styles.css file, at least this portion of it, and then paste it in. We'll worry about a few other styles a little bit later to make it pretty, but just at least get this part in really quick. And then when you look at the browser, you should see a white screen with a button in the middle that says begin trivia. And if you click it, it should do absolutely nothing. Okay, just wanted to quickly knock that out before we go back into the script.ts file. So to continue on with the TypeScript here, I want to make sure that I have an index and a correct value. The index is going to be which question we're on because we have an array of questions and we know we're going to start off on the 0 index because the first item of an array is 0. And we're going to go through and increment that index as we go to each next question. And then correct is how many questions we've gotten correct. We want to keep track of how many questions we've gotten correct. That way in the end, we can calculate the score. But let's take a look here. Notice that these are both numbers, 0 and 0. Now I could come in here now that I'm using TypeScript and say number. And now I'm officially declaring the type here. Now that's good. This is a good thing to do, except we don't really need to say number here. And we'll see how this type checking stuff works in just a moment. We're not quite there yet. We're still getting the the code written out. But just know that when you assign a value for the first time, when you initialize a variable with a value, it becomes inferred that this is the data type that you're assigning it to. So if I were to hover over index, you could see that it says that index is a number. And we can do the same thing here. So we don't have to specifically declare the types here. It is actually inferred. Now you can do whichever one you prefer. Some people debate this, but I'm just going to leave it like this because we can clearly see that both index and correct are numbers. Now let's come down here and let's create an empty variable here. Let's say let new variable, and let's say that this new variable is supposed to be a string. Okay, so let's say it is a string, but let's not assign it yet. So new variable is a string, and then further down in the code, let's try to set new variable equal to index. We know that index is a number, and we know that new variable is supposed to be a string. So let's see what happens if we try to assign index to new variable. So new variable is equal to index. Notice that my code editor is complaining, and when I hover over it, it says type number is not assignable to type string. And if I save, I can see that during the compilation process, it found this and said type number is not assignable to type string. So what this is doing is it's protecting us from actually finishing the compilation process when it knows that there's some sort of inconsistency with the data types. So interesting stuff there. Let's move on a little bit, and we'll definitely start to see more of the goodies as we go through. Now, the first thing any user is going to do when they load this app is press the begin trivia button, because that's the only thing on the screen right now. When they load the app, they're only going to see the begin trivia button. So we have to set an event listener on this button so that we know when they click it. So let's start by doing that. We already have a reference to the start button here, so I'm going to copy that and paste it here and say .add event listener. Now, my code editor, what it did was it automatically added this question mark here. And this is optional chaining. It automatically did that for me. Now, if I were to get rid of it, notice that start button element gained a new squiggly line. Why is that? Let's hover over it. It says object is possibly null. Remember when I was talking earlier about how these could potentially be null? Well, here it's saying, look, add event listener exists on HTML elements, but it does not exist on null. Null does not have any functions. So if this were to be null, we would get an error here. This would break, this would explode, and we would not be happy. So what it's saying is, if we add this optional chaining parameter here, if you know how optional chaining works, I've got a video that I'll link in the description below if you're not familiar with optional chaining. But if you understand how optional chaining works, it's not going to run this function unless this exists. So therefore, this question mark is kind of saving us. However, I don't want to add this optional chaining parameter every single time I reference any of these. So what I'm going to do is actually end up wrapping the vast majority of the code here inside of an if statement that checks whether or not all of these exist. Now, if any of these don't exist, if any of these are null, I don't really want to run the code at all because something really bad is happening in the index.html file. So it's okay if I check here and say, if all of these exist, then run the code. And that's what I'm going to do. So I've simply just created an if statement that checks that all of these exist. And if they do, then we can run the code that's inside of this if block. If they don't exist, we're not going to run any code at all because again, we wouldn't really be expecting this to run anyway if those don't exist. So now I can easily go in here and grab that start button element and say add event listener without having to add that optional chaining. Now, the type of event that I want to listen for is click. And I want to run a function whenever the user clicks on the start button. So the very first thing I want to do when the user clicks the start button element is I want to hide the start button and show the containers for the question. So here I am hiding the start button by setting the display to none. And then for the submit button, the question text and the answers select, all of those elements, I'm then setting the display to block because initially those were display none. So now they're going to be visible in the DOM. So just to quickly look and make sure that that works, I click it and now we see a submit button. And obviously we don't have the question text set and we don't have any multiple choice answers inside of here. So what we have to do is actually begin the process of grabbing the first question out of our questions array and displaying it here. So we're going to end up needing to write some functions that are going to both get the next question and also display the next question. So we're going to have a function for both of those. But before I start getting into that, I want to actually type this questions array because I'm going to be using questions throughout the app. And I want to make sure that the structure fits. And I want to make sure that I type this early on. That way I don't run into any unexpected bugs in the future. So how can I write a custom type? I know that the type is essentially an array of questions. So how could I define a question type, which contains an ID, which is a number, text, which is a string, answer, which is a string, and then wrong answers, which is an array of strings. How could I define a type that looks like this so that I could assign a type to this array? Well, one way that I could do this right off the bat is to say any. I could say that this question's value is anything. It could be anything, but that is way too broad. That would not really provide me any value whatsoever. Well, I could say that it's an array of anything. I could say it's an array of any type of value. And now there's a little bit more value because we know that it's an array. So if I tried to access this in a way that makes sense outside of the context of an array, it would show me errors before I tried to run it, and that's good. But again, that's not specific enough for me. I want to make sure that if I later on in my code try to access some property of a question that doesn't exist, for example, questions.value instead of answer. Let's just say I'm writing the code and I say questions.value instead of answer. I want it to tell me, hey, value doesn't exist on questions. I want to make sure that I get this type as specific as possible. So I can actually create a custom type, and that is what I'm going to do up here. Now, to create a custom type, all I have to do is say type. Now, you can use, obviously, to assign variables, you can say let or var or const, but I'm trying to assign a type, so I'm going to use type. I'm going to call this type question. And question is an object. Make sure to include my equal sign. Question is an object because this array of objects is an array of questions. Each one is an object, obviously. Now, each of these has an ID, which has a number. I'm setting ID to have a type of number, and then I'm ending it with a semicolon. Now the next line is text, which is a string, and then we have answer, which is also a string, and then finally we have wrong answers, which is an array of strings. And in order to tell TypeScript that this is an array of some particular value, I can do this two different ways. I can either say string and then provide the array brackets afterwards, which tells TypeScript compiler that this is supposed to be a string array, or I could get rid of this and say this is an array, and then in angled brackets, I could put string inside of here. Notice that when I hover over wrong answers, it gives me the same display as last time. They're the same thing. There is a little bit of extra value in doing things this way, but that's for the more in-depth tutorial that will go on later. That has to do with something called generics in TypeScript. And if you're familiar with other type languages such as Java or C# or something like that, you already know what generics are, but don't worry, we'll do a full in-depth tutorial on TypeScript in the future. Just understand that array string like this is the same thing as writing it like this. So I'm going to go ahead and write it like this for now. Okay, so now I have a question type. What I can do is actually get rid of this any and replace it with question to say that questions is actually an array of question types, and then I'm assigning it equal to an array of questions here. Now that protects us because now I can come back down here. Let's say later on in the code, somewhere out in the code universe, I try to log something like question.value. I try to access value on the question, or actually I should say questions 0. So let's just try to access the first question in the questions array and try to access the value on that. If I hover over this, it'll say value does not exist on type question. It will not let me compile this. If I try to save this, the compiler is going to complain. So now I have type protection on there, but it's not just about protection. Let's say somewhere out in the code universe, I'm in a different file, but I'm using this module. I want to log something related to question. So I say questions 0 to grab any, the first question, and I type in dot. Well, now it already knows the values that could potentially exist for any given question. Answer, ID, text, and wrong answers. So if I'm new to this code base, or if I've been away from it for a while, I can look at this and see, oh, instantly, okay, these are the available items on a given question. And not only that, even more than that, I know exactly what type of data it's supposed to be. I know the data type for each of these. So if I hover over answer, you can see this is a string. If I go to ID, I can see that this is a number. Wrong answers is an array of strings. So I'm getting this protection, but I'm also getting this almost like documentation baked right in automatically, which I have found to be extremely helpful for me when dealing with larger code bases. Okay, cool. So I have the question type and I've set that. I want to go ahead and start writing the functions that I was talking about earlier. And I want to just make sure that pretty much all of the code I write is inside of this if block. So I'm just going to give it some space here at the top so that it's easy for me to see. So the first function is simply going to be a function called getNextQuestion, which is going to return a question. And I'll get back to that in a second to explain that syntax. But just know that this getNextQuestion function is just going to return the item in the questions array that is equal to the index that we currently currently have set here in state at the top. And then after it sends back that question, it will then increment it. So let's say it's 0. It's going to return the first question, then it's going to increment it, and now index is going to be 1. So the next time I run this, it's going to give me the second question. It will then increment it, and then the index will be 2. So about this right here, what we can do with TypeScript is assign types to values. And we know that this function is a value. And I can say that I want this function to return some very specific type. And in this case, question. Now let's say I get rid of this because it indeed is returning a question with this code here. But if I comment this out and just say return 1, then it's going to complain. It says type number is not assignable to type question. It does not like that. It will not let me save this and compile this. It's making sure that I return a question. And if this function was huge with a bunch of ridiculous logic inside of it, that is super helpful because if I write something wrong, I will know that I'm not returning the type of value that I was originally expecting, and it will help me pin down bugs a lot easier. So with that said, I can uncomment that out and put this back and know that this function will always return a question. But notice it's not taking logic into account because let's say index is 45. Well, index is 45 and there's only 3 questions in the array. So if we tried to access the 45th question, clearly something's gonna break. In fact, let's see what happens here. I'm gonna put 45. Let's try to access the 45th question when there's only 3. Well, it compiles fine. There's no problems here. There's nothing that's giving us a red line. I wanna log what get next question is. Come in here, save this console.log get next question, which is apparently gonna return the 45th question. We go in here, we click the button and you can see it's undefined. So TypeScript was not able to determine the possibility of it being undefined. So as you can see in this particular case, it was not able to determine that it was returning undefined. Now, since I know that specifically, I know in my head that there's technically a possibility that I could be returning undefined here. I could come in and say that this function returns either question or undefined. Notice the single pipe character. This is saying that this function can return either question or undefined. And I know that actually to be the case, so I'm going to leave it as question or undefined and return this to the way it was a moment ago. So what I'll do here is say const next question. I'll assign a variable here and set it equal to get next question. Now, if I hover over next question, I can see that next question is either going to be a question or undefined. And I can know in my head, since I know that it's either going to be a question or undefined, and I know that in the case of undefined, it means that we're outside of the length that there are of questions, if that makes sense. Then I can check underneath here and say if next question. And if next question isn't undefined, then I know that there's still another question in the queue and we can continue displaying the next question. However, otherwise, we can actually end the game and show the score. So that's what we're going to do here. If there is a next question, we're going to run a function that displays this next question. Otherwise, we're going to hide the trivia elements and show the score. So underneath my get next question function, I'll create a new function called display question. Now, display question is going to take a question as an argument. And see, I can actually put inside of this function that I'm going to be expecting a argument specifically of type question. And this function is going to end up returning a void, meaning that it's not going to return any particular value. It's going to return void, meaning we're not even going to have a return statement at all. Or returning void could also look like this, where I just have a return statement with no value actually being returned. And with this here, I know that there's type protection because if I were to try to run display question here with, say, any value other than a question, such as a number, it's going to complain and will not let me run it with a number. So what is going on in this function? Well, we're taking the question element text, setting the inner text equal to the question text, which we know is a string. We're taking the answer select box and wiping it clean because it could potentially have all of the answers from the previous question in the DOM still. So we're wiping that out. Then we're setting an answers variable, which is going to be equal to all of the incorrect answers for the question along with the correct answer. But we're going to need to scramble that, and we'll do that in a moment. But then we're looping through all of the answers. And for every single answer, we're creating an option element, setting the value equal to the answer, setting the inner text equal to the answer, and then finally taking that answer option element and injecting it into the actual select box element in the DOM. So again, we'll have to scramble those answers because we don't want them to be in the same order every time, because then we're just going to know, well, the correct answer is always the fourth answer on the list. We don't want to do that. We want to scramble them. But for now, let's just make sure that the functions are working, and then we can add the cherries on top in just a moment. So saving that. Then inside of the statement here where I'm checking to make sure that there is in fact a next question, I want to call display question. And I want to call that with my next question. Now, if I were to try to run this function here inside of my else block, you could see that it's going to fail. It's going to say argument of type undefined is not assignable to type question. That's because we know that display question needs to accept a question. And we have this if statement here. And in this else block, we're basically saying that question, next question, is undefined. Well, if it's undefined, it's not a question, and it will not allow us to call it here. So potentially this is helping us find a bug, because if we try to call this function inside of this else block for whatever reason, it's going to stop us. So let's put it where it belongs. Let's save it. Let's see if we can run this. Now I actually see the question text here. I see the answers, and I always know that the fourth one is the correct answer. Now, if I select that and click submit, nothing happens. That's because we have not yet set the click listener for the submit button. So I'm just going to quickly add the scramble function. I'll just add it here below the get next question function. Here is a function called scramble answers. It's not a fully randomized scramble. That's perfectly fine. I don't want to overcomplicate the tutorial. So we'll just do a very basic scramble, and it's going to accept a argument called answers, which is an array of strings. And then it's also going to return an array of strings, just in a different order. So for answers here, instead of setting it equal to this array, I'm actually going to set it equal to scramble answers and then pass that array into here. Now, when I save, go back here, click begin trivia, the order is different. Notice that George Phillips is the last one. If I refresh, now George is the last one, George O'Dowd. All right, looking good so far. It's time to set up the event listener for the submit button, because when we answer a trivia question, we want to go ahead and determine whether or not they got it correct. If they did, we want to increment the correct value up one. If they didn't, we don't want to do anything at all, but then either way, we want to make sure we go to the next question. So let's begin. I'll set this event listener up above my start button element. We already have access to the submit button element, so we'll do the same thing here. Submit button element dot add event listener of type click. Want to make sure that we pass in a function here, and first thing we want to do is determine whether or not they got the answer correct or not. So if they get the answer correct, we want to increment correct up one. So how can we possibly determine whether or not they got the answer correct? Well, we know what the correct answer is for the current question right now. So let's access the questions array and let's pass in the index. But remember, every time we get the next question, we're incrementing the index up one. So let's actually say index -1, just to make sure that we're on the correct question. And we have an answer property on that question. So we know what the correct answer is. All we have to do is determine whether or not that answer is equal to the answer that they selected. So we actually have the value in the DOM at the time that they click the button. We know that we have an answers select element, and we can access the value property on that. Now notice something. This is saying property value does not exist on type HTML element. What is that talking about? Well, it's saying that HTML elements, think about a paragraph tag, for example, it doesn't have a value attribute on it. Only certain HTML elements have value attributes, specifically HTML input elements or HTML select elements, like in this case, because this is a select element. If we go to the index.html, we can see that we're using a select element here. Select elements have a value property, but generic HTML elements do not. It just so happens that this is actually a select element, but it doesn't know that. It doesn't really know what type of element we're grabbing from the DOM. So we can actually come in here and tell TypeScript that this is a very specific type of HTML element. And we can do this by something called casting. Now I'm going to add in some parentheses here and an opening and closing angle bracket where I'm going to specify that this is an HTML select element, very specifically a select element. And then on the other side of this angled bracket, I can paste back in my answers select element. So let's take a look at this. Inside of parentheses, we have HTML select element and then answers select here. And then we're accessing the value on that. And now it's no longer complaining. So what we're doing is just checking to make sure that the correct answer is equal to whatever they selected in that select box. If it is, we're going to take correct and increment it up one. Now, I just realized that earlier I was talking about having this check in here to determine whether or not there is a next question. And if there's not, we're going to show the end score. Well, actually, this is inside of the start button event click listener. So we should never show the score when they click the start button. That doesn't make any sense. That's my apologies. We actually want to do that check up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this else block here because we don't want to show the score ever on a start button click. We want to show it when they submit the answer to the last question. So I cut that else block out of there. And what I want to do is actually have a check up here that determines whether or not the index is still less than the questions.length. Then this way we'll know whether or not we're on the last question or not. And since we're performing this check, we can go ahead and go to our get next question function and get rid of this or undefined piece because we actually have an if block that's going to be checking whether or not the index is out of range or not. And that if check is right here. So we're not going to call that unless index is in the proper range. So we know that that function will always return a question and never undefined. And since we know that now, we can actually just call display question with get next question directly because we know that get next question will always return a question. So now we can call that directly, and I can actually do the same thing here. I no longer need this next question variable or this if check. I can simply call display question with get next question. And I can feel confident that the changes that I made aren't going to break me because I'm using TypeScript and I'm not seeing any red squiggly lines here. All right, let's test this out. Go to the browser. I'm going to click begin trivia. Now I'm going to select George Phillips, click submit. And now I see the next question with the new answer list here. Now I'll just submit the next two. Now when I select this, nothing's happening. That's because we're not doing anything in the case of it being the last question. So let me actually go back to the TypeScript file here and add an else block here. And now this is where I'm going to have a function called show score, which we haven't written yet, but this is where we're going to call it. We're going to call it if index is now going to be out of range of the length of the questions. So I'm going to add the show score function below the display question function right here. And all this is doing is it's calculating the score by dividing correct by the length of the questions. Then it's multiplying it by 100 to get the percent. And then I'm using math.floor here to round it to the nearest whole number because we don't want to have some ridiculously large decimal. We just want to have a percent value, and then we'll just simply round it. Then we're going to set all three of these displays equal to none. Then the score element we're going to show, and then set the text equal to your score, followed by the score and the percent sign. Now I can come down here and uncomment out my show score function call. Let's have a look and see what happens. I'm going to purposely get 2 correct and 1 incorrect, which should give me a percentile of 66% correct. Okay, so the first one is this one. The second one is this one. And then the last one, I'll purposely get incorrect. Now I can see the correct score here. The app is successfully working as expected. Now I just want to make it look a little bit prettier, so I'm bringing over my VS Code here to the right so that I can write some CSS and see it update live on the left. All I really want to do is add a little bit of spacing here and a little bit of padding. So for the answer select, I'm just going to add some padding. Let's say 7 pixels of padding, and let's set the width equal to 100%. Then I'll do the same exact thing for all of the buttons. And then each of these just needs a little bit of margin. And this will also set the padding to 7 pixels and the margin to 10 pixels. Let's also set the text align to center. Okay, I think this looks a little bit better. Let me add box sizing border box to each of these. I'm actually just gonna make all of these margins just simply a margin bottom. And now I think this looks a lot better. It's not amazing, but it certainly looks cleaner than it was. So we'll do that, Mandrake, and then Cherry. We got 100%. All right. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you have a better understanding of TypeScript all around. Now, don't forget that we are going to be doing more TypeScript tutorials in the future, so this is pretty much a prerequisite for those, but it's enough to get you started with TypeScript on your own. Let me know in the comments if you've used TypeScript in the past or if you've heard other people talk about it. Just let me know your thoughts on TypeScript in general. And while you're down there, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next video.